Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the webinar on addressing data needs, challenges and next steps, perspectives from Europe. My name is Elena Viñas. I'm Commissioner for the Spanish Financial Markets Authority, and I'm also co-rapporteur of the EU Platform on Sustainable Finance subgroup on data availability and usability. Now, today we have a excellent panel to discuss data, the data needs and the challenges. It's really interesting because whenever, and I don't know if all of you share that feeling, but whenever we talk about sustainable finance, at a certain moment of the conversation, the elephant in the room becomes visible, and that is the lack of data. Whether we talk about availability, the lack of data that is not sufficient, whether it is the quality of the data, whether it is that it's incomplete, not comparable, not meaningful, sometimes even not reliable, not verified, not audited. Now, despite the fact that we still face huge challenges when it comes to data, I think we can say that the availability and the quality of data over the past years has improved, significantly improved. And part of it is because of the pressure that investors have put. Investors have been engaging with companies and putting pressure on the companies they invest in for those companies to provide them with the data they need in order to assess their sustainability credentials. But it's also thanks to regulators. And in that space, Europe, the European Union has been leading. And I also think that I would not exaggerate if I say that the Action Plan Sustainable Finance and now the Renew strategy on sustainable finance have been a game changer or mark an inflection point. And I wanted to share with you a couple of reflections. So the first one is that it's on the corporate level. So when it comes to the availability and the quality of sustainability reporting coming from corporates. So as you know, the European Commission is currently reviewing the non-financial reporting directive. It has published a proposal called the for amendments, and the non-financial reporting directive will be called the corporate sustainability reporting directive. Now, the proposal brings two key changes. The first one is that it specifies, it's going to create a specific framework for sustainability reporting, which includes the demand of a specific indicator, some common to all sectors, some very specific. And we hope that not only it requires the reporting of those standardized indicators, but it also provides the underlying methodology or the methods in which that companies need to use in order to calculate those indicators. The other area why it's so important, the CSRD proposal, is that it's going to massively extend the scope of the companies that will be required to report. The proposal includes the extension to private large companies, to listed and to listed SMEs, and basically to all the companies that have more than 250 employees. In practical terms, this means that the availability of reporting is going to be multiplied by 5. So 5 by 5 in Europe, and in some countries like Germany, there will be a multiplied by 10. Not only financial and non-financial corporates that are included in the scope of the CSRD will be providing detailed information on their ESG practices, but also investors, both at entity level and at product level. And we're already starting to see some of the effects of these, let's call it wrapping up or like better defining the sustainable finance world and the sustainability reporting world. In 2014, the sustainable investment or ESG investment made up to represented the 58.8% of the market in Europe. And in 2020, it went down to, it only represented 41.6%. Now, this is not a reflection at all of a lower demand for sustainable finance or less interest, just very much as the opposite. But it reflects how the market has started to be adapting their products, in line with the new definitions and the new requirements within the sustainable finance package. And probably the most revolutionary of all the measures within the action plan is that of the taxonomy, which basically taxonomy just means classifications, a scientific classification of economic activities. The taxonomy, what it does is it tells you which economic activities can be considered as sustainable and under which circumstances. And the taxonomy was so much needed because we were living in a sort of an anomaly in which companies and investors alike not only defined what was green, but how green they were. Now, the taxonomy regulation does not oblige anyone to invest in A or B. The only requirement or obligation linked to it is one of reporting. As many of you know, companies on one hand will be asked to report the percentage of revenue, capex and opex that is related to taxonomy aligned activities. And on the other hand, investors will have to report the percentage of their funds that is invested in taxonomy aligned activities for all those products that they're marketed as having environmental characteristics on an environmental objectives. Now, by doing so, by requiring companies and investors to report the proportion of sustainable activities that they conduct or they invest in, the taxonomy becomes a common measurement tool because it uses the same definitions and the same metrics. So for the very first time, we're going to be able to compare apples to apples. Now, the taxonomy is revolutionary for many reasons, but when it comes to reporting, I wanted to share with you four. The first one is because the actual reporting on taxonomy is not on the environmental criteria or environmental performance, but it is actually on the financial metrics. So as I said, the reporting is on revenues, capex, and OPEX. So for the very first time, we have a tool that creates a bridge between environmental performance and financial performance. The second reason is because the taxonomy captures actual environmental performance adapted to the very specific conditions of the different economic activities and actually a quite detailed level, which is for those who are very up to speed on the taxonomy, the 4 digits, so level 4 of the NAIS codes, as opposed to the large sectorial, divisions that normally we have or we use in sustainable finance. Now, the third reason is because the taxonomy takes into account the trade-offs between, on one hand, social standards and environmental standards, and on the other, between the different environmental objectives, something that the financial industries have been having problems dealing with. And last but not least, the taxonomy does not actually assess the sustainability of the companies, but the degree of sustainability of the activities they conduct. So the taxonomy operates bottom up instead of top down, which is how until now, most reporting has been, which means that the taxonomy is fully complementary to the CSRD. And probably if you then add other reporting requirements that will come along with other regulations, such as the future sustainable corporate governance, then you can start having a full picture of or investors and financial institutions will have a full picture of how companies are actually dealing with sustainability, a full picture of what the company's strategies are and what the performance actually is at entity and an activity level. Now, to help the European Commission not only develop the taxonomy in terms of developing the technical criteria for the different economic activities, but also to help the Commission to deal with the data and usability challenges attached to the taxonomy, the Commission created the platform on sustainable finance. Now, the platform is divided currently in 4 working groups. One deals with the development of the technical criteria for the 6 environmental objectives. Now, looking at the other 4, so besides climate, the other 4 environmental objectives beyond climate. Then there's another group that is looking at whether or not it will be recommendable to extend the taxonomy to cover social objectives. A third group that will look at the potential extension of the taxonomy to cover significant harmful activities and those activities that neither impact significantly nor harm significantly. And then there's the fourth group that actually is called SG5 on data and usability, the group that I could chair. Now, on today's webinar, we are going, the taxonomy is definitely going to be one of the central pieces of our discussion, but not exclusively. We want to talk more broadly about the challenges and the virtues of the European framework, reporting framework that is under development. And for that, we have an excellent panel, and I will now introduce our panelists. We have Hans Biermans, Head of Sustainable Markets for ING, Luke Hendricks, Director of Competitiveness of Enterprises and External Relations within SME United, and he's also a member of the EU Platform Sustainable Finance and of the subgroup on data and usability. Also member of that subgroup, we have Andreas Hoppner, Professor of Operational Risk, Banking and Finance at the University College Dublin. And then finally, we have Michael Piocioki, CEO of Business Reporting, which is an advisory group. Andreas, good afternoon. I was talking in my introduction a little bit about how at least the perception from many of us is that the availability of data and the quality of data has improved. Is it that really true? Can you give us an overview of what the state of art in sustainability data is? And basically also if you can also give us a sense of the size of the problem. So despite the progress that I think it has been, what is still the challenge that we have in front of us?
Yeah, so historically seen, the ability of data has moved massively. Right? The first sustainability assessments were all based on surveys where companies self-reported. Some companies didn't answer at all. Other companies self-reported, and of course, in self-reporting companies have financial conflicts of interest, trying to present themselves as good as possible. Then the next type of sustainability data was effectively scoring corporate sustainability reports, again self-reporting, but the reports were plentiful available, so it became easier to in essence score them. And then nowadays we have a lot of sustainability data that is predominantly unfiltered by the companies, because simply it uses information sources that the companies cannot potentially twist, and so the information sources are less subject to conflict of interest. We have approaches that goes via the news media, we have approaches that go very much via analyst due diligence, we have approaches that use all sort of external regulatory sources. So the overall ESG data has vastly improved over the last 2 decades. The estimation methods for specific KPIs such as greenhouse gas have been improving, although they need to improve a lot further and integrate the precautionary principle, for instance. And so we have made a lot of progress, but the things to do is further integrate the precautionary principle, be able to continuously monitor companies in terms of their accountability, pretty much regardless of company listing or company size. So right now we have enormous weaknesses on private market companies. And then also generally we need stronger incentives for the companies to report, for instance, pollution complete rather than partial. Nowadays research would find that companies do engage in reporting pollution, but they don't necessarily engage in reporting all pollution. Understandably, they try to look good rather than bad. So and that's in essence where we stand right now.
Thank you, Andreas. Can we move a little bit to the specifics of the taxonomy? Yeah, you are leading within as the subgroup on data and usability. You are leading on data and the work that with data vendors in terms of the availability of data to be used to apply the taxonomy. Can you explain the audience a little bit more in detail the work that you're doing with data vendors, and then also explain why is so important the role of data vendors when it comes to the taxonomy?
So the data vendors are crucial when it comes to taxonomy because A, not every company reports, and B, certainly not every company actually reports fully accurate. And how would you even know, right? The conflicts of interest in reporting sustainability information without very strict monetary regulation across jurisdictions are clear. So data vendors effectively have to assure investors of an independent and, that importantly, financially independent assessment of the company's green taxonomy credentials. And there is dozens of data vendors potentially interested in doing it. We are currently surveying these vendors to understand the consistency between the approaches. The good news is there will certainly be some vendors that will provide taxonomy data for pretty much any relevant entity, certainly in public markets. And so there is opportunity for everyone to get taxonomy assessments that are not financially conflicted by the corporate interest. We don't yet know, though, we'll find that out in the next 2-3 months, if these assessments will be relatively consistent or not, because of course every vendor is developing entirely new methods and they are quality controlling them as much as they can, but it's a new space. Sometimes there's difference in understanding and so forth.
Thank you. Can you, Andreas, talk a little bit more on detail around the estimates? Yeah, you were saying not all the companies, report. That's based. We're very much looking to non-NFRZ or non-CSRZ, looking to the future companies. Now, if they don't report, obviously data vendors need to do some sort of estimations. Yeah, and as you know, there've been huge discussions within the platform and outside the platform around the use of estimates. Yeah, and I think there is a little bit of confusion sometimes between what it is when people talk about using real data as opposed to treated data, estimated, and greenwashing. Yeah, and sometimes there's even an implication sometimes that if you're estimating, you are sort of like greenwashing to a certain extent. Can you clarify to our audiences, what is the real use of estimates, yeah, and what we're trying to do at the platform?
Yeah, so let's start with the first point. Sustainability information is self-reported. It's the same as any information self-reported. It doesn't matter if it's a company or organization. It suffers from a conflict of interest of the self. So the first thing that most vendors are doing is to actually just check if they trust the self-reported information. That would be plausibility checks, that would be completeness checks. Some call them estimates, some call them just QC checks. And then if a company does not report, and this particularly applies to activities and or companies outside the European Union, then there may need to be an entire estimate where there is no reporting. But these estimates are not, if they're done well, they're not done kind of out of hot air. They are done in relation to any kind of comparable activities inside the European Union or outside the European Union, where you have either accurately reported data or reported data that via the QC checks could be made accurate. And so the discussions around estimates is simply for everybody to get a reality check of the level of accuracy that the data will be able to have in the early years. And then the other thing I think that people need to always keep in mind, the by far biggest source of greenwashing is the company itself, not anyone estimating that doesn't have the financial conflicts of interest that the company has. And so that I think always has to be kept in mind, that companies, not only on the sustainability side, but also on the financial side, have been massaging accounts for decades. There's in the academic literature, there is earnings management measures and so forth. Companies have a strong incentive to pay only those credit raters that will give them the best score. So in that sense, it's not surprising that credit raters all have the same score, because they get paid by the company for it, and they wouldn't if they gave the company a worse score. Companies pay auditors, and auditors pretty much have a foregone conclusion when it comes to accounts. So the sustainability data is no different from the financial data. The only distinction is that the process that we're aiming to build is less subject to financial conflicts of interest, and thereby has hopefully a lot better governance than the process currently has on the financial data.
Could we say, Andreas, then that at some level, we're always talking about treated data, that we need to treat data in order to homogenize, and that even companies do some estimations when they report at a corporate level. Could we say that? And on the other hand, could we also say that estimates are not only necessary and important for financial institutions to be able to report, but actually really useful to improve the quality availability of data?
Yes, so for the record, not a single company I know is able to measure 100% of the greenhouse gas emissions. They all have to an extent, estimate or extrapolate the entirety of the greenhouse gas emissions. There are about 20 companies listed on Climate Disclosure 100 at Info, where we academics believe that they're genuinely trying to report 100% of the greenhouse gas emissions. There are thousands of others where we believe there is an extent of underreporting going on. So estimates, even if a company wants to genuinely just report the accurate number, it will have to estimate here or there on certain aspects, right? Every time that we do a flight, the greenhouse gas emissions that we get for us personally is an estimate, right? Pretty much any greenhouse gas emission number is an estimate, because in most cases you can't absolutely accurately measure it. So estimates are absolutely common. The question is, what is the quality of the estimate? And the even bigger question is, what is the intention of the estimate? You need to have a financially independent party that wants to get to an accurate outcome rather than wants to get to a window dressing outcome, to get to a good set of estimates that may have deviations here and there. That's the nature of an estimate, but the deviations average zero rather than the deviations average some number that is massively in favor of the company. So, and that is the big thing to understand. The problem is not an estimate per se. An estimate per se is just helping people to make decisions. And estimates, of course, have to apply to certain standards. So they have to be traceable, they have to be understandable. They shouldn't be a black box machine learning estimate where someone clicks a button and no one knows what happens. So they can, of course, use machine learning techniques, but they should be applied in a transparent and, very important, traceable manner. The same way that you can trace your foods in a supermarket, you should be able to trace the estimates. But operating without estimates is simply a practical impossibility, and most companies will internally conduct estimates. Estimates, however, should be done by a financially independent party that is not paid by the SSC, so that the average estimate is accurate and you don't have a significant bias in the average in favor of the financially conflicted party.
Yeah. Thank you, Andreas. So estimates are desirable. The question is how you estimate, not the estimate itself. And the other point that you also made very strongly, it's the importance of data vendors. Michael, let me turn to you now. One of the current debates on the table in the EU as part of the European Sustainable Finance Strategy is whether or not to regulate the ESG data market and their providers. Do you think we should regulate data vendors? And if so, how? This is a market also that is not only in terms of the quality of their estimation of the data that they provide, and it's not only about transparency, it's also about conflicts of interest, because this is a market that has undergone massive concentrations, and some of us would question whether or not we should worry about the prices and the impact ultimately that unsustainable investments of those prices and potential conflicts of interest.
Well, it's a tricky question, isn't it? It's a question of whether we should promote access to information on a fair, on a transparent level, through information that could be trusted by the different counterparties, by the investment funds, by the analysts, by individual investors. And in the current European landscape, we observe lack or absence of standardized data or agreed upon standards. We still have a continuous discussion on how things should be measured, how the impact on ecology, on the social aspects, on the governance, how it should be disclosed. There is the ongoing development by EFRAG, obviously, of the standards, and the considerations by all the different European supervisory authorities, the EBA, EIOPA, ESMA, more recently published certain standards and requirements of disclosure in that space. The data vendors and the credit rating agencies, they do base on that data. They take into account all different types of sources, and it would be to the benefit of investors to have a choice of products available on the market, information product, to take decisions on. Now, you touched upon a very important point, whether there could be potential conflicts of interest, whether there could be a bias built into certain ratings, whether diversity of these ratings could not mislead investors. We are at the stage at present where we are coining, when we are forming these standards. So I believe we should still see certain time, and we should still observe that these different multi-stakeholder environments need to agree on these standards going forward. I don't think at present we are ready to impose very rigorous regulation, although I wouldn't be surprised to see that kind of regulation coming into force in the next years. We can take a look at an example of MiFIR, which standardized access to information for the different individual parties about financial products, and that actually had a very positive impact on the entire financial market. So I wouldn't shy away from bringing regulation to that aspect. Now, I think the key would be to create that regulation in collaboration with the data vendors and data providers and the CRA agencies, in order to make sure that the standards and the underlying data can be trusted, can be accounted for, can be used by the different parties.
Thank you. If we can now move from the providers more towards the users, yeah. Hans, probably one of the most interesting developments in the past years has been that the classic users of data, yeah, those who've been asking companies to give them all sort of data points and quality as well, quantitative as well as qualitative, become today not only the users but also preparers. Yeah, today you're also facing, to report on your sustainability credentials and your sustainability impacts. Now, can you tell us a little bit more about how this having to report has impact on one hand your business, your sustainability strategy? Has it had any impact at all? And thirdly, whether or not it has affected the way you collect data and the type of data that you collect?
Yeah, thank you, Helene. Yeah, of course, it does have a lot of influence on our strategy and the way we operate. I would even say we need to solve, and I think not per se in my own organization, but in general amongst banks and also investors. We are very much focused, I think, still on collecting data, labeling, investment and loans and other services like bonds and so on as green or sustainable. While what we actually need to do is, let's say, organize ourselves better and have the right dialogue with the client. Maybe one example is that, of course, as you know, banks are very active in providing sustainability-linked loans and also sustainability-linked bonds. And the key thing is there that you agree with companies on certain targets that they are going to achieve. But what I always see is that although these instruments are a perfect starting point for the engagement with clients, meaning when you have a client that sets certain targets, for example, CO2 targets to achieve in the future, then I would expect that any relationship manager would then, after closing such a sustainability linked loan, enter the discussion with the client like an engagement process of an investor. How are you going to achieve those targets? And can we help you in any way or form with that, let's say, process, via lending, financing R&D, maybe selling certain parts of the companies or acquisitions and so on. And also yes? Oh, sorry.
There was a moment that we lost contact. Yes.
Oh, okay.
If you can just repeat the last sentence.
Yeah, so I said, so you would expect that sustainability-linked instruments would, let's say, be the perfect starting point for an engagement with the company on what kind of services banks can provide to these companies in order to help them achieving those sustainability targets. And too often I see that banks are very focused on collecting data, painting the loans green or identifying the green asset ratio, but not on having this active dialogue with companies to achieve the targets. And so that, first of all, I would say must change. There was recently a very nice report from the World Economic Forum on the blueprints for hard to abate sectors. That is exactly the kind of information that you need to embed not only in the products like sustainability linked or green, but also in the overall dialogue with the client on how to manage that. When I then go to the let's say the data challenge, then of course, as you know, banks and investors have very limited information on the activities of the clients. And we are asked now by the taxonomy to identify eligible exposures. That means exposures to economic activities that are described by the taxonomy. And later on also eligible means potentially sustainable, potentially sustainable is eligible, and then aligned means that they actually meet the criteria. But banks and investors have no clue in general about the kind of activities that companies have. And I would say there that we have, in fact, via the systems, limited visibility on which economic activities a company actually has. And that is because we use the NACE codes in banks, Chamber of Commerce codes, just identifying the sectors, so the main economic activities. The platform has also provided kindly a taxonomy compass, a spreadsheet that shows which activities are described in the taxonomy. But we would, let's say, benefit a lot from deeper insight in not only the main activity codes of a company, but also, let's say, the sub-activity codes of a company. So what are they actually producing? What kind of services and or products do they actually make in order to do a proper taxonomy alignment screening and to have that dialogue with that company on how to improve the various activities. Even sometimes worse, a car manufacturer in a system of banks will probably show up as a financial holding, because the borrower would in our case be a financial holding and not the manufacturer itself. So we cannot even see in theory just based on the codes that they make vehicles, let alone what kind of vehicles. So I would be in favor that the EU expands the taxonomy compass to sub-activity level codes, meaning that you have at least not the 4 digits of the NACE code, but wherever possible and needed, also the 6 digits CPA codes and the 8 to 10 digit POTCOM or combined nomenclature code. So the deeper activity or sub-activity level is needed to make, let's say, a good screening possible and to enable the dialogue. Yeah, and then next to that, what we would need is, of course, the directory of the companies and their sub-activity. Of commerce activity coding table, like we already use, but then also at sub-activity level. And so I'm not saying that we need the, let's say, confidential data of companies. Ideally, yes, of course, but it would already be very helpful to just know in which activities and sub-activities are these companies active. Yeah, and I must say these activity codes and these data already exist. The governments use this kind of data for example, for international trade. They use it for the production monitoring. So every company already submits this, let's say, sub-activity level product data to the government. And investors and banks cannot use those data. That is really a pity. It's not public. But I think that should change at least, let's say, at the level of the activities. If it's not possible yet to publish also, let's say, the more detailed production data. Yeah, and then also companies would benefit from this approach. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you, Hans. We took very good note on your ask when it comes to the taxonomy. But what I'm getting from you is that we're moving towards a need for, let's call it a huge database, that there are certain key data points that are needed by all financial actors. So we will have not only the specific information or very concrete information that sometimes companies might provide to their investors or to their bankers, but equally at the same time, there will be a whole set of data points that they're common and they're needed for everyone, whether we're talking about the taxonomy or we're talking about more broadly sustainable finance and obviously all the information that the CSRD, the directive, aims to collect. That information might be able to, it will be public. So on that, and in order to help access the data, that data that will be public, and in order to reduce the cost, the European Union has developed this project called the European Single Access Point. Michael, can you tell us a little bit more about the ESAP, the European Single Access Point? What are the goals? Why is it so important? And which elements do you think that the European Commission needs to take into account to make it a success?
Certainly. So I believe that the ESAP responds to some of these needs that Hans has mentioned, that are the needs of investors for transparent access to information. ESAP, the European Single Access Point, has been established as a recommendation of the high-level forum on the future of capital markets in 2020. It was one of the top recommendations to create a single point for investors and analysts where they could get all the relevant information from listed companies and the various, so to say, aspects of these reporting that the listed companies need to provide across Europe, across all the member states, both in terms of financial reporting, so statutory annual accounts, as well as, let's say, quarterly reports, but on top of that, information such as sustainability reporting by the CSR, as well as even going further with the information that the SMEs, particularly those SMEs which are on the path to growth, for instance, those which applied for the SME growth markets, those SMEs also to report information to the single, so to say, access point. And the access point was meant to connect information and is meant to connect information from the 27 officially appointed mechanisms sitting all across the European member states and collating all that data. However, as I mentioned, the remit of ESAP goes beyond simply financial information. So the core elements over there are first of all, the set of data that ESAP will make available, and that set of data comprises of some 400, if I remember correctly, requirements across a range of legal acts such as transparency directives, such as CSR, and a couple of other relevant regulatory frameworks. The second component is the technology that will operate that. So we have the first component of data, the second technological component, and there is a range of technologies that was considered early in the considerations. FISMA, the DG FISMA was even thinking about very novel technologies such as distributed ledger technology, the DLT, aka the blockchain. Further, it also considered other technologies such as APIs. The third component is governance. So how such ESAP should be governed, where it should operate, how it should operate. And the fourth component, a very interesting one to take a look from a European Commission perspective, was usability. So how would actually investors, from small investors, individual ones to the institutional ones, how would they access that data? How would they make use of that? And this goes back to the points that Hans brought earlier, to which level of data are we getting? Are we agreeing with the firms, and how we understand that exchange of information, this flow of information? This is still in the making. ESAP is at present, as far as I know, under the cost-benefit analysis stage, and from public information, we know that there is a plan to push forward ESAP in 2022. The details of how it will roll out are still within the Commission and between the relevant parties being discussed. But these are, so to say, the core elements in terms of the financial and non-financial information. I believe that ESAP altogether will be extremely important. It will have similar impact on the European capital markets like EDGAR in the US.
Thank you, Mike.
Michael, may I ask you a
Hans,
short question?
I was going to go back to you, Hans, on the ESA project. So what were your views on that? So you can include your question back to Michael on that. And I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit more how you think that the ESAP project will help, reporting banks to report not only against the taxonomy, but more broadly, thinking of the Pillar 3 reporting requirements.
Yeah, maybe I'll then first ask my question to Michael, because it is related to this. So Michael, of course, a single access data point is extremely important. Everybody would like that. But in the end, it's about what is in there. The key change that we see now in the EU taxonomy is that the EU taxonomy is at activity level, or actually often at sub-activity level. And so in the investment world and in the banking world, we were always used to data like sustainability ratings and so on at the level of the company. And the taxonomy breaks with that way of thinking. It goes to the sub or activity level of the company. So do you think that the let's say single access point could accommodate that, so that you can actually see what we need in the taxonomy also at the level of individual sub-activities of companies, read products or services, or product groups or services groups, data.
So I think this is a really valid question. And technologically, yes. From the data standpoint, however, I think we still need a couple of things to achieve before. Let's take a look at examples. We already have disclosures published, draft disclosures published by the EBA and by EIOPA in this particular space, adding classifications such as the EU Green Taxonomy to the, for instance, issuance of loans, or in the case of EIOPA, there was consideration on the asset by asset reporting level. So they try to assess, so to say, apply the criteria listed by the EU Green Taxonomy to the particular financial products. We know of initiatives such as, for instance, the Global Financial Innovation Network and the Bank of Lithuania trying to also describe such requirements and match the Green Taxonomy, which is, as you said, activity-based, with product, so to say, view, with exposures view, with risks view, and so forth. I think these considerations will still need a little bit of more time and more elaboration on how they tie together. So this activity view is one view that the Green Taxonomy provides, but the supervisors are taking a bit more traditional view still, by product, by classes of assets, by different types of exposures, by risk, and so forth. So I think it needs to converge, and we already observe certain, let's say, baby steps in that field, or initial steps in that field of converging these standards. So I personally believe that yes, we will see data sets which would use the classification from the EU Green Taxonomy and apply to the more traditional space. And such data sets, yes, they could be, particularly when we are talking about public part of supervisory disclosures, they could be made available on ESAP.
Yeah, if I may, on that point, because I think sometimes there is a slightly confusion with the way the taxonomy operates, yeah, and I think that you're absolutely right, Hans, and you as well, Michael. The taxonomy operates at activity level, but even more importantly, it works bottom up. So, and what that means, what it means is that, for example, I am a electricity producer, yeah, and I have 2 plants, just to make it very simple, yeah. My average carbon intensity might be 150 grams of CO2 equivalent per kilowatt, but one of my plants, let's make it easy, yeah, and they are my revenues is 50-50, so each plant contributes equally to my revenues. One plant might be at 200, so it might be exceeding, you know, the threshold of the taxonomy, and the other one might not. If I report at entity level, I would be saying that I am 0% taxonomy aligned when it comes to revenues. But the way the taxonomy works is that I count the revenues that are generated from those plants that meet the requirements. So in that case, it will be 50%. So by the very fact of the number I report, I'm already, you know, providing investors a much more detailed information that is absolutely complementary to the information that the CSRD, the directive, will ask, which is at entity level. Now, what we assume is, some of us, is that the following question from the investor to the company would be, okay, now give me a little bit more details of the state of affairs of your different plants and operations, yeah, and that conversation happens. And I think that it's different to sometimes the perception of activity, because activity in that case, there is only one activity, which is electricity. So very much depends on what type of business model, what company we're talking about, whether we are talking about the activity, the taxonomy equivalence, a product, or we're going to look at it from bottom up at the level of the plant. And I think that is a really important point, and something that the taxonomy is bringing, you know, to the sustainable finance market, and to investors, that is going to be extremely
And Helena,
helpful.
what I was saying there is that at that sub-activity level, the EU monitors all production in Europe. And by the way, also other countries outside Europe use the same methodology. So those codes are internationally also harmonized, which is a big advantage. The EU monitors that at sub-activity level. So you can actually see at a deeper level than the NACE codes, that a utility actually produces, let's say, renewable energy and other energy. And so there is a system in place to show this. The only thing that we need is some visibility on the data behind that, because it is not public. And I can give you another example. Yesterday, I talked to a chemical company, very interesting. They are working on their taxonomy reporting, but they were lacking the sub-activity codes of their buyers, because they would like to see in which of the products from our buyers do our chemical products end up, so that we can identify which of those products are actually enabling products and lead to sustainable revenues. And you cannot do that without insight in the sub-activities of the buyers, meaning, do they use the chemicals for something that is sustainable or for something that is not sustainable?
And I think
And if
that's
you want to
really
automate
good.
that, machine
Yes.
readable, you need to use code.
Yeah, and I think your point is well taken, Hans. I think that we need to distinguish then what is the actual official reporting under, the taxonomy regulation, and how companies are going to calculate that, and then what sort of extra information it might be needed, in order for the users of the taxonomy, in this case financial institutions like yours, when they want to really apply that information. But talking about, you mentioned suppliers, yeah, it's really interesting. So if I may, we're going to move the conversation from the financial institutions to actually the corporates, the non-financial companies. And we always talk about, or when we talk about reporting, we always concentrate, or it's a given that we're talking about large companies and, generally speaking, listed large companies. But in reality, when we look at the European industry, SMEs play a critical role in the European economy. So today we're going to center the discussion, or the voice of the corporates is going to be the voice of the SMEs. Look, you can you help us, disentangle, this, or help us deep into what is the real problem with SMEs when it comes to reporting? When we always talk about SMEs as if they were one unifying unit, yeah, like one unit or a unifying group, and in reality they're very heterogeneous. Also, many of them, or some of those SMEs, actually do have a big impact, environmental impact, and they could actually contribute significantly to achieve the European environmental goals. However, when it comes to the CSRD, and I was talking in my introduction about that extension of the scope, only non-listed SMEs have been included. We understand perfectly the reasons behind it, but do you think that from an environmental perspective, dividing the SMEs into listed and non-listed is the most efficient divisions? Which SMEs should respond, for their environmental footprint, and how?
Thank you, Elena, and I'm certainly willing to help you. You're completely right. I mean, as such, the division between listed and not listed SMEs is not the most efficient division. But this is not the question here today. You rightly said that some SMEs have a significant environmental footprint, but this does not mean that all the SMEs have this and that they should report on it. SMEs, or if we look at who should report, especially also in the framework of the CSRD, the listed SMEs, I do not think that there is a problem, because there is indeed the need for transparency. The need for the public in general to know what happens in a listed company. But this is not the case for the majority or the rest of the SMEs. It's all about transparency. If there will be a general obligation for SMEs to report according to the CSRD, who will read all those reports? We have also to take into account that SMEs have limited resources in order to be able to report. What you said in the beginning, I mean, as such, we have nothing against sustainable reporting or non-financial reporting in general, because we think that indeed this can be a very useful tool for the entrepreneur as such, if it remains voluntary. It is an excellent management tool for the enterprise, and this is often forgotten. And also in the proposal of the CSRD, this aspect of a non-financial report as a management tool is completely absent. The focus of the proposal in the European Commission is on the need of some investors, some academics, some stakeholders, but not to use non-financial reporting as a management tool for the entrepreneur. And in addition, we can ask the question if the taxonomy, if the CSRD is really the answer to reduce or a mean to reduce the environmental footprint. We think that we should more concentrate on actions in order to help SMEs to reduce their footprint instead of reporting on their possible footprint.
Yeah, but look, I recall a former colleague of mine that always used to say, you cannot manage what you cannot measure, yeah? So at some point, if you want an SMEs to measure, I mean, to reduce their CO2 emissions, for example, they need to measure them, yeah? And then there's only one more step, you know, reporting is just making it public. Is there a case for making certain indicators for certain SMEs mandatory? And on that, and we have discussed this within the platform, look, which is even if they're not obliged, many of these SMEs might be suppliers of large companies and might be asked by them. Or if these SMEs want to access green finance and take the, you know, advantage of the benefits, to start with, there is an expectation that green finance will provide a lower cost of capital, then they should, you know, sort of voluntarily, yeah? So would you be in favor of maybe doing a selection of indicators for certain SMEs? Is that the way forward?
Yes, indeed. But as you said, Lena, for certain SMEs, certain indicators. But there we have to look, and this is also what the work we are doing at the moment in EFRAC, to see which kind of data, which kind of indicators are available at an affordable cost. And what are the data needs of our clients? The big problem with the CSRD is that the Commission did not do this research, and they leave it up to us to come up with an agreement between the demand side and the SMEs. We do not know what kind of information our clients, our banks need from the SMEs. And our clients and our banks do not know what they can expect from the SMEs. So there we have to come to an agreement on to see what is feasible, what is accessible, and what is available at a acceptable price. Because of course, it would make no sense that an SME would have to go outside to look for outside the services that can, for example, calculate their environmental footprint, because this is extremely costly. What we try to do, what we try to find out, is to see what kind of information is already available in the SMEs, in the majority of the SMEs, for example, and that we can work with ranges, with electricity bills, that we can work with certifications, for example, in order to report on the basis of this kind of information. But this is still something that we have to discuss.
I may
Hans, I think
contribute here a
Hans
little
wants
bit.
to
So ING was, of course.
No,
Sorry.
Hans, you wanted
Oh,
to make a
sorry
comment
for
from a
interruption. Yeah,
user
no,
point of view.
yeah, small contribution. ING participated in a pilot from the EBA to calculate the green asset ratio. So we needed to know what the exposure is, of course, to companies with green activities, including SMEs. So what I did was reaching out to the National Statistics Office for the Dutch part of the business and asking them for the environmental account data. And as you know, it's obligatory in Europe for all the member states to publish environmental accounts. And that is twofold. One, the environmental spend of all the companies. And two, the amount of, let's say, turnover from environmental goods and services. So basically the sustainable activities. But unfortunately, Eurostat uses a slightly different definition than, for example, the taxonomy. But it doesn't matter. I asked for those data. Of course, I didn't get it because it is confidential. I couldn't get company-specific data. So I asked, okay, can you then share sector data with me so that I at least can see what the percentage is of environmental spend, of the total spend of a sector, also in the SME sector, as well as the amount of environmental goods and services. So I did get that, and it was very insightful. And all the statistics offices across Europe already reach out to SMEs to collect those data. So I would say we are close to what we need, but only we need to harmonize the criteria behind such let's say behind the environmental accounts on the one hand and the taxonomy on the other hand.
Yeah, which is great point to lead me to two questions to you, Luc. So one of the things I learned from you is that we don't need a reduced reporting framework. So take the large companies framework and then do a reduction. What we need is an adapted framework for SMEs, which goes into the lines that what you're saying. So let's look at what is out there and see, how much of the information can already be used and see what is the gap. But so if you want to comment on that, that will be great. But my question, the second question would be, today for the taxonomy, in the taxonomy regulations, or shall I say, the delegated act on Article 8 has excluded SMEs from the numerator of the ratio of the banks, and has said, well, for the time being, they're excluded in. It's a scheduler revision for mid-2024. Then, subject to an impact assessment, we might or not include it. Let's see. So, what are your views? What needs to happen? How should that, in the revision in 2024 look like?
Well, I can be very short on this. I think, Elena, the reason why SMEs were excluded is simply because it was uncertain if they would be available and if it was possible to give the necessary information. You rightly said there will be a revision on the basis of an impact assessment to see if it is possible, if the SMEs, what will be the impact on the SMEs, and we have to wait for the impact assessment. So as such, I think we have to avoid, and therefore, as such, we do not have a problem to be included it, but let's wait for the impact assessment if indeed the SMEs can provide this kind of information, always on a voluntary basis, because we have, of course, to avoid that SMEs will be excluded from green finance. So this is our main concern. We do not want that the SMEs are excluded from the green finance, but let's see what the impact assessment will deliver. But therefore, we have to wait and to see what kind of information SMEs are able to deliver.
Thank you. Look, and we're running out of time. We're coming to the end of our sessions, but I don't want to leave for us to leave without touching on the international angle, because one of the recurring comments over and over that we hear is that financial markets are global by nature. So therefore, what we need is an international sustainability reporting framework and or a global taxonomy. Michael, the IFRS Foundation is moving forward with the creation of the new International Sustainability Standards Board, which will develop a set of disclosures, if you wish, that countries and the different jurisdictions could build on. But it will. The aim is to build that sort of international framework. What does that mean for Europe? You know, what does it mean for the European Sustainability Reporting Framework and Program?
In principle, it would need it would mean a need for alignment and for collaboration. Otherwise, we are going to end up with disparate or I wouldn't like to say different, because there is an extent of cooperation between the IFRS Foundation and, for instance, EFRAG. These bodies work together closely, but we may end up in two different paths or strains of the standards. One where EFRAG focuses on the overall ESG and the European context, and another one, the IFRS Foundation, working closely with the Value Reporting Foundation, with standard setters such as SASB and CDP, focusing in the first place, as the trustees announced, on the ecological aspect, and further on moving into the social and governance areas of disclosure. Well, the IFRSs are used across the world in more than, if I remember correctly, 100 jurisdictions, but primarily by listed companies, by larger enterprises, consolidated accounts, not so much for the SMEs. Whereas I think in Europe, as Luke mentioned, we want to include SMEs. We need to think about proportionality in this case of application of any regulation. I think this is key for realistic implementation of regulation. In terms of the IFRSs and EFRAG developments, I'm somewhat optimistic, because these two bodies seem to be in a dialogue. However, to which extent it will result in a converge or at least aligned standard is yet to be determined and to be observed. What comes to mind here, and what would be my, I would like to call it an advice, but an observation towards both EFRAG and the IFRS Foundation, is the story of how we unified and harmonized standards across central banking space back in 2007, 2009, when each of the different national central banks implemented in a slightly different way the Capital Requirements Directive, the requirements for so-called COREP and FINREP reporting. And in 2007, between those years, 2007, 2009, under the auspices of the Committee of European Banking Supervisors, and later taken over by the European Banking Authority, central banks got together under a group called Eurofiling, and they came up with a low-level, data-level understanding, harmonized understanding of what are the common, so to say, requirements they would like to ask from the banks, particularly banks operating across jurisdictions. So if someone was to report in Italy, in Spain, in Germany, and in Poland at the same time, to come up with a common, so to say, model. Here, I believe that sometimes focusing on high-level principles may not necessarily be so fruitful when it comes to alignment of standards. We need to get down to the details. We need to get down to the data, to the KPIs, to the measures, to the metrics. And maybe that level would enable these two, so to say, strings to converge a bit better, these strings of development of standards. But for Europe, it means that clearly on the international space, there is an emergence of such a global standard. Considering the impact and adoption of IFRSs globally, I think that this, well, we will be observed by many different jurisdictions, which are currently the users of IFRSs. Very likely they will follow with the ISSB standards. As the first, so to say, principle. The ISSB, the IFRS Foundation has announced that they will base their developments, among other, on the TCFD disclosures by the FSB, which already gives it a little bit, gives us a little bit of understanding which way the ISSB wants to go. I think this shouldn't be conflicting standards, and I hope that there will be no two different, so to say, disparate strings of developments, but rather than that, there will be more like an augmented reality of sort, where European aspect may, take into account the international one and detail that in spaces where necessary and amend it in spaces where necessary. We are a big user of IFRSs, of course, the European Union, all across the different aspects. So I think that this may lead to this strong collaboration and reuse. That's my hope. Which way it will go, tough to say.
May I react on this?
Very
Elena?
quickly, because we are running out of time. Please.
Of course, we have nothing against international alignment, on the contrary, but our fear is a little bit as like IFRS and SASB. All those standards, they are developed for and by the big corporations and not by the SMEs. So we have to avoid those standards, and we have an extremely bad experience with IFRS for SMEs. So therefore, I think it would be good if the European standard would take the lead and to take really into account the needs and the possibilities of the SMEs.
Thank you. Look, unfortunately, I have to bring to a close this conversation. And if I was to summarize, and of course, being very aware that I'm not going to give justice to the richness of all the contributions from our excellent panelists, but if I were to summarize, I would say some of the key takeaways would be: number one, yes, we need to regulate data providers, but with them, we need to do it hand in hand with them. Banks are moving into the space of engagement, right? Into the space of engaging with companies, which until today has been very much reserved for investors and shareholders. So we can expect much more of a deeper dialogue between banks and companies when it comes to sustainability. There are two initiatives that should be followed very closely: the European Single Access Point and the IFRS development of international sustainability reporting framework. There is a lot to be gained on the ESAP side. The availability and accessibility of data would increase tremendously if done correctly. And on the IFRS, we could have, an international framework that at least uses a minimum common denominator in which, other jurisdictions will build their mandatory requirements. Now, the wish for, I think, all the panelists is, one, that the European reporting framework, influence as much as possible that development. The secondly is watch out, to what you ask SMEs. Do not just replicate the code or the demands for large companies to SMEs, because they need a very specific and adapted reporting framework to their needs and capabilities. And with that, we're going to pass it on to the organizers and the next panel. Thank you very much. And thank you for listening.